Hi, welcome to Building with Virtual Development Environments. I'm Oscar Reed. I'm going to get started in a minute. Well, it's 11:15 now, but there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure I get through it all. If you have questions during the presentation, just feel free to raise your hand and ask away. That way we don't advance before, if something's confusing or unclear, you have questions. But hopefully we'll have time at the end, or we can chat afterwards if you have questions as well. This thing does not work on this machine. What are we going to look at today? I don't click. We're going to look at the benefits of using a virtual machine, setting up a virtual environment, and updating your workflow. Is everyone familiar with what a virtual machine is, first of all? If you're not, it's a way to emulate another machine on a host hardware. So your main machine might be a Mac, but a virtual machine will let you run in an Ubuntu environment that works just like a real server. It's also what a VPS hosting system uses. You know, there's big hardware, and you buy a little virtual private server that runs on it in its own little container. Well, not container, probably not the best word to use, but its own little box. So for all intents and purposes, it looks like a real separate physical dedicated machine, but you're sharing space on the host machine. And using a virtual environment for development will impact your workflow. We'll look at how to update those. So who uses XAMPP or MAMP? Quick show of hands. Or Acquia Dev Desktop? I mean, that's pretty popular. Homebrew, ports, etc. Stuff on Mac. Yeah, fun stuff. Anyone still working on a shared development environment with other devs? Okay, then you're in the right presentation. Anyone still doing development on production? Yeah. Okay, that's probably something you want to stop doing immediately. So how did we get here? Early tools for working on development projects were pretty crude. You know, they were often one size fits all. We did our development on our laptops or desktops using XAMPP and MAMP, but those environments were, you know, pretty monolithic. So as a result, they're difficult to customize per project. You can't have one client who depends on 5.5, but your dev desktop has to run 5.3 because you have a client on a older code base. Which makes it tricky to update. If you update your PHP to 5.6 because there are new features you want to play with or just get security patches, you might be breaking a code base that has to stay on 5.3 because that's what production is on. And it's also inconsistent across individuals on a development team, right? Like your laptop may be configured with XAMPP, someone else might be using something else and may not configure it exactly the same way, which leads to problems down the road, right? So as I've alluded to, projects are special snowflakes, right? Depending on where they get hosted, if you're hosting them yourself or putting them out on HostGator or BlackMesh, there can be different PHP versions on each environment. Different extensions may be enabled or disabled or required by your project. You might even be working with different databases or even versions. Someone might be on MySQL 5.5, someone else might be using Maria. You might have a project with a NoSQL backend, whatever. And you might have additional services for caching and integration like Redis or Memcache and that sort of stuff. As a result, there are some common pitfalls you're inevitably going to run into. There's going to be mismatches between development environments, staging and QA environments, and the final production environments. You'll run into bugs that only happen on live when you deploy, or bugs that work on one developer's machine but not another's, which is annoying and tedious and a big waste of time to debug. As a result, setup can be tedious and fragile, right? If everyone has to configure a new project to run on their machines, they have to know their local environment and make tweaks and what PHP INI settings to go and change, what other extra packages you have to install and enable and download and compile and that stuff. And oftentimes, because everyone's doing their own thing, no one's documenting it. Setup is poorly documented, which can really bite you when it's time to hand off code to whoever's deploying it, whether it's a client or an internal hosting team, and they say, okay, well, what do I need? What versions of Solar should I be running on production, or do I need MySQL? That's never a fun conversation to have when it's, hey, let's launch. So enter virtualization. What this lets you do is use a virtual machine that's identical to the production environment, as close to identical as possible. The holy grail is that they're, basically clones of each other. You automate setting up of the virtual machine, which is called provisioning. So everyone's not configuring the virtual machine by hand. There are tools that will automatically configure it, download dependencies, set up virtual hosts for you automatically. Which the big benefit of this is it's a lot easier to share setups with collaborators. So you've got a team of 2 developers and a front-end designer who's going to be theming, a DevOps and QA folks who are also going to be looking at the tool and closing tickets and that sort of stuff. One person can set up the machine, take an afternoon or weeks, depending on what tools you use. It can be a lot quicker than that. Configure everything, and then hand off that recipe to everyone else to use and have an identical environment set up on their machine. Of course, as I alluded to, a nice bonus of this is you document how to set up a VM. Documenting how to do this provides a step-by-step guide to setting up any instance. You can even go so far as then using those provisioners to set up machines in the cloud automatically on AWS or DigitalOcean and Linode. All those folks have APIs where you can stand up and tear down machines real easily. Every step in setting is in a configuration file somewhere that you specify, which also makes it great for client handoff if you're just delivering, like, here's the machine. Just configure your environment to match, and you should be able to launch. Like I said before, virtualization is hardware virtualization or platform virtualization refers to the creation of a virtual machine that acts like a real computer with an operating system. That's the full definition for virtualization from Wikipedia. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically it's a way to run any machine on a host machine. And as far as the client machine, guest OS knows it's a machine all on its own. It's a real boy. It doesn't know it's a puppet. A great tool for doing this. There are many. Virtualbox is commonly used. It's the one we'll look at today. Because it's free. It's open source. You can get it for virtualbox.org. It runs on Windows, Linux, Macs, and more. But there are other virtualization technologies like VMware. If you're on a Mac, you can use Parallels. There's tons. The great thing about VirtualBox, it's free. You can play with it immediately. It's not the most performant, so if you really need to squeeze out every bit of performance, you can eventually look at some other tools. But this will get you started. As far as hardware, on your desktop or on your laptop machine, anyone still work on a desktop? Yeah, I'm kind of old that way, but I like mine. Memory helps a lot. So my desktop machine has 16 gigs of memory. Memory is cheap. You need enough to dedicate to the guest OS. So if you want to give your virtual machine 2 gigs of memory to play with, you have to have that kind of spare. You can usually run like Drupal in a 1 gig machine. It'll be fine, but the more memory you can give it, the better performance you'll get. You also need to have plenty of disk space because you're going to use files to represent and persist like virtual hard disk storage on the guest OS. VirtualBox is smart in that it can resize and grow those virtual drives as needed, so you're not going to dedicate, like, I have to give 20 gigs of space that's just going to be for this VM. It's a little smarter about that. Along with VirtualBox, the real tool that makes this useful is called Vagrant. It's a tool for building complete development environments. There's great documentation on vagrantup.com. But basically what this gives you is a Vagrant file, which will configure the machine in any virtualization provider. Out of the box, it's with VirtualBox, but you can put VMware and Parallels and the rest to work with it. It pairs that with a provisioner that will automatically configure the virtual machine for you. Of course, these don't spring from the head of Zeus automatically. Someone has to make the Vagrant file recipe and the configuration scripts behind it so that everyone can benefit. Cool. Let's get to the good stuff already, right? Assuming you go home tonight, you install Vagrant and Virtualbox. Maybe stop by and at the Apple Store buy more memory for your Mac or whatever. What's the easiest way to get a VM working? Puffet is the easiest way. It's an online GUI to create virtual machines. So you go online, go to puffet.org, I believe. Should have a link coming up. But basically, you go in there, you click, I want to run CentOS with PHP 5.4 or 5.5 and MySQL 5.6. I need these extensions. Set up my virtual host this way. And there's a ton of configuration options, so it can handle pretty complicated setups. But all you're doing is point and clicking your way through a wizard, essentially. At the end of it, you download a zip file with the Vagrant file and the Puppet scripts to configure the new virtual machine.
So just to go back for a second, so
Sure.
Virtualbox, so to use Vagrant, you have to have Virtualbox?
Technically, no, because you could use VMware or Parallels, but it's easy to get started with Virtualbox. So the first thing you do is download Virtualbox, then get Vagrant.
And then get Vagrant.
Yeah.
I didn't know if they were together.
No, they're separate, but linked.
I didn't know if you use both of them.
You do need both of them. Sorry. This is what the UI looks like. So you have a bunch of tabs. It might not be legible, but you can pick versions of PHP to install. You can install Node or Python. Down the left side, there's more things like databases and additional tools. But it's all form-driven and very nice, easy to use. Your first machine, if you haven't done this, this was probably a good way to build your first machine. Once you have that zip file, to use it, extract the zip file to your project's root directory. So you have my project somewhere, just unzip right there. The basic Vagrant commands for getting started, Vagrant up you use to spin up the machine. The very first time, it'll take a while because it's going to do all the provisioning. So it's going to update packages, it's going to configure Apache, configure PHP, MySQL, all those things. You might as well grab a cup of coffee and come back in a few minutes and make sure it's still running. Once the machine is running, you'll have a Virtualbox running. You can SSH into it using Vagrant SSH. And then it's just as if you SSH'd into your production environment or your stage environment somewhere. You're on the Linux command line, and you can do anything there that you could do in a real command line. It's a real command line. It might just be a little slower. Has anyone played with Vagrant at all? Cool. Let me know. If you have questions, let me know. I'll pretend to answer them. So there's some other Vagrant commands that come in handy. You can use Vagrant suspend. It'll put the virtual machine to sleep, so you can use that between work sessions. It makes it a lot quicker to spin up the machine and shut it down. You're not totally turning it off. Vagrant stop will turn off the virtual machine completely, so the next time it starts up, it takes a little longer because it actually goes like the real boot process that the server would go through. Vagrant destroy, if something's not working or you need to start from scratch, they'll delete the virtual machine completely and you can start from scratch. If you're playing with the configuration files in Puppet or Vagrant and something just gets totally out of whack, this gives you a clean slate to start with and try to fix whatever went wrong. So after you unzip your file from Puffet, this might be what your project looks like. Web might have your Drupal code, and then you see there's a file called Vagrantfile. It'll create a little directory called provision that has all of this Puppet. Puffet is called Puffet because it uses Puppet to provision the code. There's different provisioners, which we'll mention later, but these are just automated ways to configure things. Download packages for your OS, configure PHP, set up MySQL, all those things have little recipes in Puppet. So if you really want to dig into where are the configuration settings and how are things working, it would probably be in there. Say, ooh, now you have a VM. What can you do? Well, we're going to look at how you work with the files, viewing your development site in a browser, and then if you're working on a Drupal site, how would you run drush? One way to run drush. So the way you work on files, Vagrant will map your folders from your host OS into the guest operating system. The guest operating system will think they're local files. You can edit those files in your favorite IDE on your main and on your host machine, and any changes you make in there get reflected in the guest OS automatically. By default, Vagrant maps your project folder, so wherever your Vagrant file is, on the host OS to /Vagrant on the guest OS. You can change that in the Vagrant file config if you want, or if you want to map more directories than that. So for example, if your project is /homo marita Drupal 8, the same files, if you SSH into your guest OS, are in the /Vagrant directory. Of course, this isn't without its little gotchas, which are file permissions. So especially for Drupal to work, you need to ensure that the web server can write the site's default files. If you're using features and you want it to be able to auto-generate the features for you, you got to make sure it can write the site's all modules features or wherever you put your features. So there are different ways you can get around this gotcha. There's not one clear, really great way. You can mount with anyone can write file permissions, so that you just essentially turn those off. You could run Apache as the Vagrant user. So when you log in, you're this user called Vagrant. You could just tell Apache to run as that user by modifying the Apache config file, and then they'll have the right file permissions. Or you could add the Apache user in your guest machine to the Vagrant group in the guest machine. But there's this page on Drupal.org that has instructions for how to do any of these and deal with them. That's the first thing you'll probably run into. You'll go upload an image to a node or something, or you go look at status and it'll say it's not writable. So you want to make sure you get that taken care of. At the end of all this, it means you can work on PHP, CSS, image, and other files locally with your favorite IDE, text editor, Photoshop, or whatever to make images. And the changes are automatically reflected in your virtual environment. You don't have to FTP the files or rsync them or deploy them to your guest OS. It all happens behind the scenes. For many PHP projects, the default shared maps work pretty good, which is what Vagrant does by default. For Drupal, or if you're dealing with a lot of files, that tends not to scale as well. So you should consider using NFS mapping. It involves a little more setup. It's documented, though. If you Google for it, the details change a little bit depending on if you're on a Mac or Linux or Windows machine. But once you enable NFS, you'll notice that Drupal, working on a Drupal VM is a lot more performant. Like the modules page comes up faster and database queries run a little quicker. Features generate faster. If you're patient, you can stick with shared maps. Now to bring your site, you've got this Virtualbox running. It thinks it's its own server. You can access it through a browser. So your Vagrant file will set up networking so that the VM is accessible from the guest OS, from the host OS actually. So it's usually, and it's a line you'll see in there, and you can change it if you like different addresses. It's usually a private address like 192.168. something something. And there are other address ranges, IP address ranges that are reserved for private use that you can use. You want to add that IP address to your hosts file. So it usually looks like, the IP on the left, and then whatever local development URL you're going to use on the right. Like I usually use .dev for my local domains, or I'll do local.client.org or whatever. On Windows, anyone develop on Windows? Yeah. Anyone drink a lot? How's that correlate? So on Windows, a host file is trickier to find. They bury it in like System32 file folders. So usually you can use find files or Google for where it is on your version of Windows. You'll need admin privileges to edit. That's true on Windows, and also you'll need to be root on your Mac or Linux machine. So you could sudo to edit it. There's also a plugin that makes life easier if you're doing this a lot, especially if you work with a lot of machines, so you want the addresses to change automatically for you. It's called Vagrant Hosts Updater. And then it'll like look in the Vagrant file and update your ets host file for you automatically. Once you have that set up, you can just go to http:// whatever local domain you're using in your browser, and your site should come up. Any questions so far?
FTP into it. Oh, and it doesn't matter.
You can SSH into it. I mean, you could, if you need FTP into it, you would have to install an FTP daemon.
Files are all on here.
Yep. No, that's a good, legit question. The last thing you should do, you often, when you're working with Drupal, need to run drush commands, usually to clear caches or something. What I do is Vagrant SSH to log in to the VM, run cd to wherever your Drupal site is, and then you can run drush commands. Important thing to do this is you have to make sure you install drush on the guest machine so that it's available as a local command. So if you're using a Debian-based or CentOS-based Linux, you can pull in drush from the repos. It's a slightly older version usually. If you need the latest and greatest, you'd have to figure out how to automate it in your config, in your provisioners. Or if you don't want to deal with that, you can set up drush aliases to work on a remote instance. In this case, the remote instance is the guest OS. Anyone not use drush? Drush is awesome. I like it. Drush is a lot easier to, if you haven't looked at it, for like development tasks like clearing caches, rebuilding the menu, or updating search index. Or if you get a new site and you don't have an account on it, and you have like a local snapshot, or you have access to that machine, you can go and use drush to give yourself a user account, which is a good tool to know about. Sure. Yeah, it's a regular SSH connection. You just have to make sure your Vagrant box is running for drush to work, and then you give it the IP. You could use the IP, or you could use the host name that you give it as when you're configuring the drush alias for the URL or whatever URI. Yeah, I think Vagrant sets up a keyless user, because when you do SSH Vagrant or Vagrant SSH, it automatically logs you in without a password. That's not a bad question. You might run into user key issues, but I know Vagrant doesn't lock down the machine a lot. Of course, if you want to cheat, you can get a Vagrant Drupal development environment pre-built for you. It's not really cheating, but there are two that I know of on Drupal.org/project VDD is for Vagrant Drupal development. It's a fully configured Linux-based VM based on Ubuntu. It's got certain versions of Apache, PuPHPet, and the rest. There's also DrupalVM.com. It's a little newer version of Ubuntu, and it'll also, I think it has a UI kind of like Puffet, where you can add or enable at least optional dependencies, like if you need Solr for searching or Selenium for BHAT testing, that sort of stuff. It's got them all pre-configured for you. You can turn them on and off as needed. And I've heard that's a real time saver. So because provisioning a machine can be, a pretty arduous task, and it's great if you want to learn Puppet or Ansible or whatever, and then have those scripts for spinning up new virtual machines on Amazon or wherever. This will get you up and running faster. Of course, the downside to doing this is, and it's at least my pet peeve is if your client is hosting on CentOS, try to use CentOS on your virtual machine. If they're using PHP 5.4, still on PHP 5.4, don't use a Vagrant machine that has 5.5 in it. There's not a lot of incompatibilities between PHP versions, at least after 5.4 really, because 5.4 introduced short array syntax and some other things. But you really don't want to waste an afternoon tracing, why a new module is not working because they did something weird that expects a newer version of PHP that's not on your target environment. Because that just gets back to the whole, like, oh, it works on my machine. Why doesn't it work on stage or QA? Any questions on the technical stuff there, or
I'm gonna add one more to that list that
Sure.
went through this slide. There's a GitHub project called Vlad, Vagrant, Lamb, and Drupal.
Oh, okay.
To the DrupalVM.com. PHP configuration is optional for the YAML file.
Oh, cool.
Some of the ones you made are various ones.
Vlad.
Vlad.
Cool. Just remember Vlad the Impaler. I always need a mnemonic like that. Anyone using virtual environments on a team yet? Still already? Cool. You can chime in here if you have other good tips. Some useful collaboration tips when you're working like that on a team. So when a project starts up, one person should be responsible for the initial setup and configuration of it. If you have a Drupal environment like this, it might also mean, hooking it up to your code repo. So, well, that'd be part of your project, because, never mind. What I was thinking is, like, the part that I like to automate is doing put an initial database snapshot into the provisioning process, so that when it spins up, the machine has like a preset state, and it's not like the Drupal install state. You'll have some whatever basic content types or that you need already defined. You should commit your Vagrant file and any folders that it expects into your code repository. That just makes it a lot easier for someone else to grab it and have if someone needs to fix a Vagrant machine or add a new service to it, because you decided, oh, well, now we need memcache for caching because it's going to be a little faster. They can do it, just update, and next time they do Vagrant up, it'll reprovision it and add whatever's changed. As a side effect of that, however you version your projects, you should be putting Drupal in a subdirectory of it, usually called web or public, or I've seen HTML or something, or public, or with like some of the shared hosting for HTTP docs. But that should be a subdirectory, and then you can have other directories that are part of your project that aren't what goes out on the web. And especially if you have a lot of people on your team, you might want to you should standardize on a version of Virtualbox and Vagrant. They release pretty frequently, and I've run into situations where, like, I have an upgraded Virtualbox and I have a machine running, but Kevin, who's our designer, installed the latest version of Virtualbox, and now something doesn't quite work, or Vagrant. He's got a newer version of Vagrant, and the syntax is a little different, and the Vagrant file needs to be updated. And that's just a little bit of a headache. But if everyone's kind of standardized, upgrades at the same time, or at least coordinates upgrades, then it can make life easier that way. So I've mentioned provisioners. Basically, what provisioners are, and sometimes like sysadmins call these configuration management systems too. They're ways to describe in code and configuration files how to set up a machine and configure all the services on it. Because at one point you might outgrow puffet, or there's also, if you like Ansible, which is a different provisioner, there's Fanciful. You might outgrow the Drupal development ones. You might need to set up a machine that runs a different version of an OS, dig up an older version of CentOS for some reason, or PHP, and all those things. And there are various options for automating configuration. The major ones are Puppet, Chef, and Ansible. My personal preference, and if anyone wants to chime in, they can, as long as it doesn't lead to a fight. Ansible, I like Ansible. It's more deterministic, so you know that it's going to kind of it organizes the code into what it calls playbooks. So if you're like a football fan or sports fan, the playbook is like, it tells it exactly what to do and what steps to do it. Go update all the packages from stable, and then install Apache, configure this virtual host, install MySQL, create a database within a database user. All those steps are in a playbook, Puppet and Chef do that in a different syntax. And they're also all different languages. Like I think Puppet is Python or is Ruby? I should know this. One is, so behind the scenes, one they use like a language like Ruby and Python for their configuration and the little modules that will actually then take that and do stuff on the server, like install Apache or update PHP to the version you specify. If you have very basic, simple needs and you're good with shell scripts, that it can also be a provisioner with Vagrant. The others have a little bit of a steeper learning curve, or harder learning curve, because their syntax, the way they organize files, especially with Puppet and Chef, you'll run into like there might be 2 or 3 or 4 different mod recipes for configuring MySQL, and knowing which one to use, or having someone at Puppet that has already picked one, and the options available to that aren't the same as some other one that you need. Can be a bit of a pain to dig through. And shell scripts are great because it's like whatever you do on the command line you can do in the shell script, so you can real quickly iteratively build a simple provisioner with the shell script that just kind of works. Of course, the shell script, the benefit of the other ones like Puppet and Chef and Ansible, what they keep track of is like what's been installed. They kind of know like if you change a playbook or some rule or add to it, how to update the machine without running like all the other ones at the same time, which is real useful. And there's communities around each of those that share recipes and tips for almost anything you need to configure. There's probably a module that you can plug in to each of these that will do that for you, and you just give it the settings that you need to create a database user, load a SQL file that you provide into that database, and just handle all the like minutia of how that actually gets done on their own. Those of you who use these, who's using Puppet? Yeah. How do you like Puppet? Do you ever have to dig into it?
No.
No.
Love it.
Yeah.
We do a lot of Python too.
Yeah. It is Python then, right?
Yeah. Probably Python, Chef, Ruby, Ansible. I have no idea.
Ansible, it uses YAML as its configuration files, and I don't know what it is behind.
It's actually written in Ruby.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, Puppet and Chef can use YAML files as well. So
Oh, okay.
For the configuration, you don't have to do that.
Right. That sounds like keyboard. Once you have you're comfortable with setting up a Vagrant machine, this opens up a lot of possibilities for things you can do. Because it's not just, I mean, it's great for sharing dev environments and standardizing on that. All my client work is done that way now. When I start on the project, if they don't have one, I'll set up a Vagrant machine for myself. And it's great when you inherit like those projects where the old developers left under mysterious circumstances, and no one knows how he set up things or where things are or what needs to be run. And it's a great exercise for them. Like, okay, well, now I'm going to do some software archaeology and figure out what version of Apache, how's it configured. Oh, they're using Solar. This is how it's configured, and you document it all for them. But then it also lets you do stuff like, well, if you need to test if your code is going to run with PHP 5.6 or even 5.7, which is coming down the pike, you can spin up, you could, save your normal working environment, clone it, like the files, and change the provisioner to load PHP 7 and see if your site still runs without affecting, your main day-to-day dev copy. If you need to switch MySQL for a different compatible distribution like Percona or Maria, is it going to work? You can do that. Run your environment, hopefully run tests or click around whatever and see if you run into any issues. If you want to test, is it easier to set up or what's more performant, Redis or Memcache to put as a caching backend? Spin up a new VM and see, which one has the best documentation for doing that and setting it up with Drupal. Which modules do you like? That sort of stuff. Or if you need in scale, you want to prepare and you want to figure out how to set up Varnish and put that in front of your site. Everyone familiar with Varnish? Varnish is awesome, like many things. Varnish is a reverse proxy, caching proxy. So what it does is it sits in front of your Apache or Nginx or whatever your web server is. People request stuff. If Varnish doesn't have it in memory, it'll ask for it, for Apache for it. If it does, or your web server, if it's in memory, it just gives them the copy in memory, so it caches it somewhere. And it's super fast, and it uses very little memory to do that. So if you have a public site, you don't do a lot of personalization or interaction, it's great to put in there, and then you can like scale like another couple orders of magnitude. But it's got its own configuration language called VCL, which is tricky to learn and understand. And if you did it on a Vagrantbox, you have a much more safe environment to play with, like a sandbox, where if something goes awry, you're not breaking the stage set, you're not breaking production. Back when I had to put Varnish in front of a big site, it was pretty nerve-wracking because I did it locally. It kind of worked, but my local environment was different. And this was like 5 years ago now. Then I tried, well, I'll just put it in front of our staging site because only we use that internally. And that was also nerve-wracking. And then finally I put it in front of production. And nothing really broke. And it all worked. But if I had like an environment where I was more confident that if I messed something up, it's not affecting real traffic, then that's a great safety net to have. One cool Vagrant thing. It's not really Drupal related, but the PHP core team provides a Vagrant box if you want to test 7. You just download the box, get it up and running, and it's all pre-configured to run whatever latest snapshot of PHP 7 is out. Similarly, you could use a VM to test Drupal 8. I'm sure there are more than these. These are ones my colleague Sandy and I worked on last year. And they're on GitHub, so if you go there, you download it, you can get a Drupal 8 VM to play with and check out. When you spin it up, you'll get the Drupal 8 install process, so you'll go through that. And then you can click around and see what's coming up if you haven't already looked at Drupal 8. Pretty good on time. Thanks. If you follow me on Twitter, I'm Omarita. Once I post my slides up, that'll be one way to get notified. I'll also put them on the GovCon. I think we can attach them to our sessions as well. I'm the editor-in-chief of PHP Architect magazine, so if you're a writer, I'd love to talk to you, or a budding writer, even if you want to write technical articles, we should chat. We also do conferences, training, and books. You've probably seen our booth table space outside. So if you want to chat more, check us out. Any questions on Vagrant stuff?
Absolutely. I guess I don't understand the relationship between Vagrant and Puppet.
PuPHPet builds the Vagrant files and the Puppet files that you need for Vagrant to run. So, like, if you think of it as a pyramid, at the bottom you have Virtualbox or something that creates the virtual boxes. Vagrant and its Vagrant file is a way to automate Virtualbox or whatever your environment is. But Vagrant needs those configuration files to exist, which you could write yourself and cobble them together. Or you can go to PuPHPet or Fanciful or whoever and click through and build a Vagrant file. Because if you look at a Vagrant file, maybe I should add that. It's just a text file, and it has like settings for like, this is my IP address. This is how you do shared folders. You can even do stuff like give this virtual machine 2 gigs of memory. Let it use 4 of my cores or whatever. And at the end of it all, it says and here's where to find the provisioner. The provisioner is the tool that does all the like real grunt work of updating system packages, downloading Apache, and configuring it, adding PHP modules and INI settings, all those little like the tasks that you would do at the command line.
How much two Vagrant boxes communicate with each other? The scenario I'm thinking of is
Oh.
mimicking a setup for like a solar server on a separate server.
Yeah, you can do that. Well, my first thing, gotcha, is like you have to make sure you have enough CPU and memory to run them both. But then you can, by default, Vagrant uses what's called private networking, I think. And you give it an IP address, and you give the second machine a different IP address. They should be able to talk to each other using those as the IP addresses, which means you might have to like put them in each of their hosts files, so they know, or do some domain name stuff on your router so that they can talk to each other. If you don't use private networking, it has I think it's called public networking, and it's different. The reason I'm confused on this is if you actually like dig in the Virtualbox, it's called bridged networking, where the virtual machine becomes essentially another machine on your on your router or your local network. And it's a full thing. It'll get like its own IP address automatically assigned via the HCP and all that stuff. You don't need to do assign it manually an IP address. What I hope I'm getting the terms right, because by default the networking Vagrant uses is all natted behind the host OS. So only machines on that host can see each other. So if you had one Vagrant machine running on one host and your colleague is running the Solar one on the others, then you probably need to use the bridged networking so that they can see each other.
Yeah, I was curious. First of all, great presentation covering the basics of doing Vagrant development.
I don't know him, by the way.
Yeah,
unsolicited.
But I was curious, have you looked a lot at Docker's kind of the new hotness?
Yeah, and were you in Ben's presentation yesterday on Docker?
It's kind of a self-serving comment though, because I do one of the maintainers of the Docker cards.
Oh, okay. He knows Docker a lot better, and we were actually chatting this morning about like the use cases for it. He still uses Vagrant for a lot of local development. He thinks if I understood him correctly, like the use case for having an environment configured exactly like production is easier with Vagrant. Docker is more performant, and it can be used for local environment development. But like every service should be a separate container, which is different than Vagrant. So if you need a Drupal site, you're going to need a container for Apache. You're going to need a container for MySQL. If you're using Solar, you'll need a container for Solar, and then get them all to talk to each other. But they're not really competitors. They're just alternatives, and they have different use cases. I honestly haven't played with Docker enough to figure out like the real advantages. But if you have questions, Ben's the guy to talk to. And if you don't know him, I can introduce you to him. He's a cool guy.
You showed a URL on Vagrant permissions.
Vagrant permissions. Was it way back here? This one?
Yeah, no.
Yeah. You can also Google Vagrant permissions. It's not limited to Drupal. Lots of folks struggle with this. Anyone else have questions or praise? Yeah, I'll take praise. Sure.
Good presentation. I would recommend making sure you're running mail catcher or mail calls.
Oh yeah.
You're running those Vagrants and working locally can save you from
sending mail. Yeah. If you're going to need to send mail, yeah, do that. You don't want to. Usually, I recommend against running your own mail server anyway. Use Mandrill. Mandrill is awesome. They have a free. Everyone knows who Mandrill is, right? Or MailChimp. Everyone's heard of MailChimp. So Mandrill is the service that powers sending emails for MailChimp. It's the same company, but you can go get an account, and you can go get an account. It's free. You get like some ungodly amount, like 12,000 emails a month, which is more than enough even for some clients. And it basically you can use the SMTP authentication module and configure it to talk to Mandrill as if it was a real SMTP server. for sending email. So you don't need to have email locally configured or an email server running on your Drupal box. Just offload it to them. They take care of making sure it gets out and doesn't get caught as spam. But yeah, that's great for real live sites. If you want to catch, make sure you don't spam like the client or you're doing a newsletter internally. Use which one did you recommend?
Well, the one I backed over explained, they packaged in Mailcatcher.
Mailcatcher.
The Drupal VM project that you referenced packages in Mailhall.
Okay.
And those are just sort of Drupal notifications or other.
Or if you go to like even just like a request a new password link, they all go to one person. Or you create.
Into an internal, it's a web accessible URL on that Vagrant.
Oh, okay, that's different.
Catches email sort of out to an SMTP server, so you can view it.
There's also a module I'm blanking on name, which will actually like reroute the mail to another address. That's a good one to add. Thanks. Cool. We can go queue for lunch then, I suppose.